Hello, and welcome to the next in the Law Center's biweekly webinar series. Today, we will be talking about business responses to homelessness and COVID-19, the good, bad, and ugly. As a reminder, we are now the National Homelessness Law Center, formerly the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and we're so glad that you can join us today. We have a great panel, and I'm eager to get started. Next slide, please. Today, you're going to hear from a number of different panelists. I am the moderator. My name is Tristia Bauman. I'm a senior attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center. You'll also hear from Professor Sarah Rankin, who is the director of the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project at the Seattle University Law School Korematsu Center. She's also a founding member and a board member of the Third Door Coalition in the Seattle-King County area. You'll hear from Joseph Calder, who is a law clerk with one of our favored pro bono partners, Sullivan and Cromwell. You'll also hear from Chris Harris, who is the director of the Criminal Justice Project at Texas Appleseed in Austin, Texas. And you'll also hear from Aaron Goodling, who is the research and development director at the Western Regional Advocacy Project, a major organizer of unhoused people throughout the Western United States. Next slide, please. Before we turn the panel over, I just want to go over a couple of quick housekeeping matters. If we get to the last slide. One, this webinar is being recorded. We get asked that a lot. You'll have access to both the recording and to the slides that you see featured today. So check out our website, www.nlchp.org, for that later this week. You'll also get a follow-up email that likely has a link to the location on the website where you can find that material. There's also the ability to ask questions during the presentation, and we're going to reserve time. This is a 90-minute webinar. We're going to reserve the last 30 minutes or so for Q&A. I will be moderating that session, but a lot of the questions are going to be coming directly from you as audience members. You'll notice on your GoToWebinar control panel, probably on the right side of your screen, that there is a questions tab. Click on the arrow and you can enter in. You'll see it says type question here. Enter your question right in that box and we'll be able to see it. Some of the questions will be answered in real time via writing. Other questions we'll address as part of the live session Q&A. Thank you very much for putting questions in that panel as opposed to the chat box. But do feel free to chat with each other as the webinar continues. Next slide, please. So today we're talking about business responses. We all know that businesses are important stakeholders in communities for a number of different reasons. They also play a key role in policies addressing homelessness. That can be a constructive role where they can be important lobbyists for positive solutions to homelessness. And you're going to hear about some of that from Professor Sarah Rankin. And it's not the case that businesses need to be large in order to be helpful. You're going to hear today from Joe Calder, who has been working on the COVID-19 response tracker, one of the many resources that we offer on our coronavirus specific page on our website that lists out different types of responses from governments and private actors, like even small businesses, that have helped to provide people with the food, services, hygiene facilities, and other items that they need, both because they're unhoused and because they are unhoused during a deadly COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the good things that businesses can do, I think it's important that we talk openly and honestly about the roles that businesses have played in responses to homelessness. And it is the case that businesses have played a destructive role. And we talk about that in the Housing Not Handcuffs 2019 report, in addition to some of the positive things that businesses can do. And we make recommendations around that. But you'll hear from Aaron Goodling, for example, about the roles that business improvement districts have played in not only lobbying for criminalization of homelessness measures, but also enforcing those measures using revenue raised from local property owners and funding private security to enforce the same policies that we at the Law Center and our partners litigate against and lobby against. You'll also hear from Chris Harris, who will tell a story about how businesses have influenced what the homelessness policy has been in the city of Austin that has had a a unique trajectory on the one hand, but also a trajectory in its approach to homelessness policy that I think is reflective of the approach that many cities take to the issue of people living outside, when we should all be supportive of a human right to housing and ensuring that people have what they need to get inside. So with that general framing and with a reminder to please check out the Housing Not Handcuffs 2019 report for information about businesses' responses, as well as other key information relevant to preventing and ending homelessness using the power of the law, I'd like to turn it over to our first panelist. You know her, you love her, Professor Sarah Rankin. And no, we still can't hear you. Just one moment, folks. Thank you for your patience while we troubleshoot.
No.
Oh, yes, you just kicked in.
Oh, okay. So I can get rid of my headset then and just sort of work through my computer microphone, it sounds like. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you sound great.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. And you can see my screen?
Yep, you're great.
Okay, so what you should see over on my screen, if we're being successful here, I think my computer's having trouble ever since we kicked into mode here. Sorry, folks, one moment, I'll pull it back up. See if restarting it helps. Isn't remote learning and presentation fun? It's awesome. All right, can you see it now?
Yep, we can see it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. So great. We're all here and we're all together. So I am Professor Sarah Rankin. I am an associate professor of law at the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project at Seattle University School of Law. And my presentation today is also in my capacity as co-chair of the Third Door Coalition, which is the focus of my presentation. And it's really about why unlikely allyship is necessary to solve homelessness and why I think business is a key ally. And now, of course, I'm getting a prompt that my computer is about to die. So let's make sure that we're also plugged in. So in any event, the reason how
Uh-oh, it looks like Sarah might have frozen. Is that the way it looks for others? That she's appeared to have frozen? Okay. Well, let's see if we can get her going. If not, we may, she's unfrozen. Sarah, can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm getting a call from the other line.
Given the technical difficulties, Sarah, can you hear me? Sarah, we can't hear you.
assume you can see me.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we can see you,
Say, go
and now we
ahead
can hear
with
you.
someone else.
And now we can hear you as well. But I don't know that she can hear us. Okay. Sarah, are you still on the line?
Sarah says to go ahead with somebody else.
Okay, very good. So let's go ahead and move right along to Joseph Calder, who will also be talking in the context of good responses that businesses can engage in with respect to homelessness, and we'll circle back to Sarah later on in the presentation. Thank you all for your patience. And Joe, feel free to take it away.
Hi everyone, as Tristia mentioned, I am Joe Calder. I'm an associate in the litigation group at Sullivan & Cromwell. For the past few months, since March, Sullivan & Cromwell and the Law Center have been engaged in a project to track responses of public and private sector actors to the unique needs of people experiencing homelessness during the coronavirus pandemic. Tristy, are you able to see all of my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Great. So I'll get started by talking a little bit about the COVID-19 response tracker, which you can find on the Law Center's webpage under their coronavirus resources. So as I mentioned, it's a collaboration between Sullivan & Cromwell and the Homelessness Law Center. We began in March of 2020. And we're tracking both public sector and private sector actors. Now, as Tristia mentioned, we're tracking primarily policies related to food security, hygiene and sanitation, different housing programs that different actors have provided, from group shelter options to individual options like hotel rooms. We're also looking at things like information dissemination and medical care for populations in need. To date, we've got about 750 unique entries. So that's individual policies that different stakeholders between governments and businesses, big and small, nonprofits, have put into place to address the needs of the unhoused and other vulnerable populations during the coronavirus pandemic. We put this tracker together with the help of our electronic discovery staff at SNC, our research library, as well as a small army of legal assistants. We receive a few LexisNexis news desk alerts every morning. In the beginning, back in March, that was about 400 or 500 news articles that came into various searches that we set up through our firm library. The legal assistants then review those entries and put the relevant hits into the tracker, and those are then reviewed and maintained by 4 attorneys at SNC. So today, Tristia and the Law Center have selected some responses from that tracker that are unique, innovative, or scalable, where businesses have been addressing the needs of people experiencing homelessness during coronavirus. And we're going to highlight sort of a broad array of policy reactions to those unique needs. My presentation is going to primarily focus on the policies related to food security, but I'll also touch on business responses to hygiene and sanitation needs, as well as some business responses that have been direct donations of funding to nonprofits to help them deliver in their missions. So specifically in the food security space, we've seen kind of a broad array of policy responses by businesses, both big and small, from your smallest, local business to your largest multinational. We've seen businesses target both a regional and a local impact, as well as a national impact. And we've also seen kind of a range of options with regards to tactics. So whether that's providing funding to a food bank or to direct populations in need, or actually providing goods. So providing food directly to those populations. So to start with some regional and national programming, we've seen grocery stores like H-E-B, a Texas supermarket chain. They've established a program to donate a meal to Texas food banks for every H-E-B product sold. In kind of a more dynamic policy, we've seen that Wells Fargo is partnering with Feeding America to establish what's called the Drive Up Food Bank program. So that turns local Wells Fargo banks into mobile food distribution centers. At sort of the other end of the spectrum, we see more localized action. So in my hometown where I live, Greenpoint, Brooklyn, the North Brooklyn Mutual Aid Society and local businesses have come together to establish community refrigerators. So they put together a new one in Greenpoint just a few months ago that is regularly staffed by North Brooklyn Mutual Aid Society staffers and volunteers, as well as provisioned by local businesses, whether that be farmers markets or local restaurants that deliver extra food. It's checked out once or twice a day. There's PPE inside of those refrigerators. A really exciting kind of very localized, hyper-specific impact that just this group of individual actors have come together to do. And sort of in an interesting echo effect on the other coast, a startup called Cheetah, which is a grocery store in California, has established these same community refrigerators. And their founders have actually said that one of the reasons that they've put together these community refrigerators is that they saw the community refrigerators in Brooklyn and in New York and decided to do the same thing around the Bay Area. So an interesting kind of feedback loop there where local businesses and volunteers came together to put together this food distribution network that's, you know, kind of unique and innovative and has been tried on the other coast in California and established by, you know, this startup that had nothing to do with the original folks in Greenpoint. Another kind of tactic that we've seen is the provision of funding. So Hannaford Supermarkets in the kind of regional New York area has donated $900,000 directly to food banks as well as homeless and travelers aid societies throughout the Northeast. Similarly, Exelis Blue Cross Blue Shield announced a $600,000 donation to several food banks in upstate New York. And we've also seen the provision of goods. You know, I think this applies most specifically to the producers of food, but you could see it maybe for, in another context, PPE. Cliff Bar announced that they will donate 7 million Cliff Bars and Luna Bars to families in need through food banks and community organizations. Similarly, U.S. Food Holding Corp in Chicago has donated $250,000 worth of food goods to the Greater Chicago Food Depository. And then another kind of like localized example, Wilcox Farms in Roy, Washington, donated 600,000 pounds of liquid eggs to local food banks and shelters, which amounts to 7 million eggs. So that's sort of the kind of direct provision of food goods to community stakeholders that I think is different from that provision of funding. On the hygiene and sanitation front, one of the kind of exciting things that we've seen is the use of mobile vans to provide showers as well as other sanitation needs. So in this second entry, you see the Laundry Truck Los Angeles, an LA-based nonprofit that is providing laundry services to individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And that project was funded by a larger gas company, Southern California Gas Company, provided $25,000 to the laundry truck in order to help them with their services. We've also seen the provision of showering and dental checkups. A local hotel and nonprofit organization collaborated together in Redmond, Washington to provide those services to people in need. And then we've also seen, you know, this direct funding for services that I talked about. So Kaiser Permanente announced that it would donate $1 million to Denver Housing and Homeless Services Fund, which supports individuals experiencing homelessness. And those funds have been earmarked for quarantine-related measures, coronavirus-related measures like expanded testing and contact tracing. Similarly, the Duke Energy Foundation announced a $500,000 donation to Roof Above, and that donation has been earmarked to help find supportive housing for individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So that's one other kind of policy that we've seen businesses take, is to donate directly to nonprofits with kind of an eye towards how those nonprofits are addressing the needs of the unhoused, especially in kind of the intersection of those needs and coronavirus. So I think one of the things that we've taken away from the tracker is the fact that we've seen a real spectrum of responses from businesses as well as from local governments and from state governments. And we've seen some really unique and innovative responses, and a lot of those responses are scalable. So I would definitely encourage everybody to check out the COVID-19 response tracker on the Law Center's website. There's a lot there. There's more there than I've kind of surveyed here. But I think the big takeaway is the fact that, you know, there's really a broad gamut of responses from big to small, regional to local, and a whole bunch of different tactics to help people in need. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this. I'm happy to take questions after everybody's spoken.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. That laid out a nice spectrum of what the COVID tracker has been capturing. Also, I'll just point out that Joe works for Sullivan & Cromwell, which is a legal business that also helps to address homelessness and is a favored partner of the Law Center. They're a member of our LEAP program, the Lawyers Executive Action Partnership, and they also frequently engage with us to provide legal research, policy research, and produce resources that we help bring to you to support your advocacy, and they certainly support our advocacy. So thank you very much to Joe and to Sullivan Cromwell. Now we will turn it back over to Sarah to hear about the Third Door Coalition. Thank you very much for rejoining us, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me now?
Sounds great.
Wonderful.
Looks great. Yeah.
The blessings of technology. And you can see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Fabulous. Okay. All right. So thanks so much for having me. I am still Sarah Rankin, Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project at Seattle University School of Law. But I really am here today in my capacity as co-chair of the Third Door. And the focus of...
We can see your presenter view, so we can see your name.
Oh, okay, so I've got the wrong screen. Okay, awesome. How about screen monitor 1?
Better.
Okay, good. Yeah, you don't want to see my gobbledygook anyway. So thank you for letting me know that. And if you guys could see behind this green screen behind me, you'd also see mountains of laundry. So I'm just going to out myself for everything that I'm not showing you. But I really do want to talk about how I came to work with unlikely allies. And I think that phrase is really helpful to return to when we think about business. For the duration of my work on homelessness and housing, I've really found it to be exceptionally polarizing. Everyone here will know how polarizing and controversial a topic that is. And especially as a lawyer, in my capacity as a lawyer, I've spent a lot of time suing businesses. For reasons that that others in this presentation will be talking about today. And it's not uncommon for me to get hate mail or angry voicemails, especially from business leaders who are upset about the work that I'm doing and the advocacy that I'm providing. And so it has been really my history as a homeless rights advocate to make enemies of a lot of people, but especially of folks in business. And so All of this, of course, occurs in the context of our current approach, which prioritizes law enforcement and criminal justice-led responses to manage homelessness as opposed to solving it. And everyone on this webinar is probably familiar with the amazing work of the National Law Center, which shows, among other work, including work done by the regional Western Regional Advocacy Project and our own Homeless Rights Advocacy Project, that approach doesn't work. It's just inhumane, it's expensive, it's often illegal and unconstitutional, and can make homelessness worse. So all of, sort of this dynamic, this controversy and this polarizing discussion happens in the context of increasing criminalization of homelessness, even though that approach has been proven to be highly ineffective at ending homelessness. So, historically, in the midst of this storm, homeless rights advocates and business, it's fair to say that we're opponents. We fight laws that criminalize homelessness, and businesses push for the enactment and enforcement of laws that criminalize homelessness. But recently, it struck me that nothing was changing. And that debates about homelessness were just becoming more and more polarizing. This took place in the context, especially of a really bruising fight that occurred in Seattle about 2 years ago. Some of you may have followed it. It got national news. The Seattle City Council had tried to pass an effort to raise revenue to address homelessness, and the tax was it was called a head tax. So it was a tax on business, and things went bananas in Seattle. Everybody lost their collective minds. The businesses that were going to be taxed started raising revenue in order to fight the business tax. People were extremely agitated, and it was probably the worst that I'd ever seen it in terms of morale. So I sort of had this epiphany where I thought, you know what, I think I need to come at this differently. I need to approach my nemesis differently. I need to come to business differently. I know that they want unsheltered homelessness to stop. I want unsheltered homelessness to stop. So we really need to reframe our source of conflict into an area of mutual interest. That was a pivoting moment for me because I realized that even though we have different motivations for wanting homelessness, especially unsheltered chronic homelessness to end, we wanted the same thing, we just didn't agree on how to do it. And so my goal then became, how do I persuade them to move from law enforcement-led efforts and criminalization to one that's more focused on human beings and non-punitive solutions? And so I really thought the shift required me to move out of my ideological context, for me not to expect for them to have the same ideological approach or even the same motivations for ending homelessness as I have, but instead to try to get them to agree with me on how to do it. And so that was a shift from ideological context to the context of concrete data and evidence about the most cost-effective way to end unsheltered chronic homelessness. And so first I started by helping them understand that there is a difference between chronic homelessness, which is the homelessness here in Seattle that most people see on the street, and homelessness generally. And so I spoke to them about how people experiencing chronic homelessness are a specific subset of the homeless population, that the majority of people experiencing chronic homelessness are unsheltered. And something that they and most people don't know is that there's a federal definition for chronic homelessness, and that definition requires people experiencing unsheltered chronic homelessness to suffer from a secondary disabling condition, one that prevents them from working or independently maintaining housing. And so examples of those sorts of disabling conditions include chronic health issues, substance use disorders, severe untreated mental illness, or often a co-occurrence of a bunch of those and other disabling conditions. So helping business understand the presence of that disabling condition was really key to getting them to look at the issue differently, because the required presence of that disabling condition helps to explain the persistence of chronic homelessness. It also creates understanding that certain interventions like job training or requiring people to just go out and get a job is not going to work as a solution to unsheltered chronic homelessness. Another important distinction that sets chronic homelessness apart from homelessness generally, that was really key to getting business on board, was to provide them with data that shows that people experiencing chronic homelessness are among the most vulnerable to impacts like violence and poor health. They already know, business already knows that people experiencing chronic homelessness are among the most visible. But it also made intuitive sense to business leaders that chronic homelessness is among the most costly to leave homeless. So those costs really stem from the fact that people experiencing chronic homelessness are among the highest frequency users of emergency rooms. They have the highest use of hospitalization compared to their others within the overall homeless population. Highest levels of engagement with first responders like police, fire, and emergency EMTs. And we have a very high tendency to drag people experiencing chronic homelessness through the criminal justice system. So what chronic homelessness does, it's such a wonderful focus for us to share collectively, because it shows how homelessness is a crisis really demanding a response. We have to do something urgent, and we have to do it together. Another key to persuading business that the focus we could share is on ending chronic homelessness is the data that shows that we actually know how to solve it. And I gave them just decades of studies showing that supportive housing is the most proven, most humane, and most cost-effective solution to chronic homelessness. So when I say that, it's important to say that, as with all housing, right, all housing is not created equal, and all permanent supportive housing is also not created equal. But there are several models of permanent supportive housing that are really well done, and they're shown to be exceptionally effective. They offer non-time limited housing with access to optional wraparound services. And it's done in a way where residents really want to stay housed. Here in King County, we see retention rates in the high 90th percentiles for our supportive housing facilities. And that's because our permanent supportive housing facilities are really well done. They retain the sense of independence and dignity that really all human beings deserve and require. So I showed them decades of proof that supportive housing works, and persuaded them that it really just needed to be brought to scale, because otherwise what we're doing, and we are really guilty of this in King County, doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and not really making a big dent in a bigger problem. So this task of bringing permanent supportive housing to scale in Seattle, King County then became the charge of the Third Door Coalition. The Third Door Coalition came about when I began a round of public presentations offering proof that our current approach to chronic homelessness doesn't work. And I began sharing extensive proof that permanent supportive housing does. And I didn't require them to share my ideological views. We actually concretely put at the center of our work the fact that we did not have to agree about things ideologically, but instead we would frame this as a place where we share a practical interest. And I discovered that, much like me, lots of people, including business leaders, were really tired of polarization. They were really tired of being pushed into one corner or another, or one side of a debate or another. And many of us are really hungry for a third option, a way to move forward out of ideological debates and focused on practical solutions. And so I reached out to some of the business leaders and told them, hey, look, I know we haven't gotten along great in the past. Sorry about all the suing that I've done in the past. Actually, I'm not sorry, but I can tell you that we don't have to continue to fight about this issue. There's another way. We can reframe our problem as one of mutual interest, and we can agree to focus on the evidence and on the data that shows the way to end chronic homelessness is through bringing supportive housing to scale, offering people integrity and autonomy in their living options, in their housing options. And so the Third Door Coalition was born. And we began really focusing on an intentional culture of collaboration and trust around this mutual interest of ending chronic homelessness through supportive housing. So we've been together for 2 years. It has not all been pretty, and it has not all been painless, but it has been some of the most important and productive work I've ever done in my life. We have a website that you can go to, and I'll give you the address at the end of my presentation, but we've completed 2 analyses. The first is a needs assessment determining the gap between the number of permanent supportive housing units we already have in our county and the growing need for it based on our estimations of what our unsheltered chronically homeless population is. We also conducted a cost driver analysis to identify the biggest drags on cost and time. In other words, what we think makes permanent supportive housing cost more and take longer to build, so that we can remove or mitigate those cost drivers and more quickly in an urgent response to the problem. We have finalized our 501c3 status, and we are now working as teams really closely with local and state government officials on our plans for ending chronic homelessness in Seattle. It has become clear to me through this work that our voices really are stronger when we speak together. There are business leaders. We've developed trust with each other over the course of the last 2 years. By the way, I should make it clear, even though we're a 501c3, everyone does this volunteer. The money that we do, supportive housing providers, and we're really not focused on sort of, donations. What we're focused on is really advocacy and trying to hold policy makers accountable. So business leaders in the Third Door have asked us really hard questions and really pushed us to provide data and talking points. But they are also taking the data we provide them and going out and spreading the word about supportive housing. We've worked together to create presentation materials, and they're actually off educating their own groups, going to business communities and talking to them about the need for supportive housing and the need to move the needle on the siting of supportive housing, the funding of supportive housing. We have networked with marketing teams who have put together a little brand package of presentation materials for everybody. We've drafted several op-eds in major newspapers together, and we're creating and sharing community education materials for impacting the public policymakers and others in our area. Another major adjustment has been that our business leaders are now actually joining permanent supportive housing providers and outreach workers when they go to lobby in our legislative bodies. So I think the Third Door Coalition is really addressing a real need for hope. And I think this work has really helped me to combat compassion fatigue that I see occurring a lot in other people. I think I really want to change the misperception that homelessness is an unsolvable problem. And I'm really hoping, especially in the current political climate, that we can find a way for people with diverse ideologies and perspectives to work together. So what we've learned through the third door is that an issue as polarizing as homelessness really requires unlikely allies. We need different resources and different perspectives to come together to create a more impactful work. And it also creates greater buy-in when we engage larger and more diverse groups. So this is, our effort to really streamline our communication and our collaboration through the third door. I've been working on homelessness for over a decade, and this is the most hopeful that I've been, that we might be able to end chronic homelessness in Seattle, King County. So I'm happy to share the spark, the hope, right, that we can change the world, change things a bit. So you can feel free to check out our website at thirddoorcoalition.org, and you'll see a lot of materials there that really talk about how unlikely alliances are required. This is some additional information that I'm sure will be made available to you afterwards, since this is being taped, but please feel free to reach out to learn more about the Third Door Coalition or the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Rankin. Appreciate that. And we do have some audience questions that came in that we will pose during the live Q&A for both Joe and Sarah. And keep those questions coming, folks. We're doing great on time, so we'll have plenty of time to address questions and answers. Moving next to Chris Harris, who is going to talk to us about the work that he is doing in Austin, Texas. Take it away, Chris. Thanks for joining. Chris, I can't hear you. I don't know if... Can't hear you yet.
Also, we're seeing your in your slides.
While we wait for Chris to pull up the slide and to get the sound working, a couple of things. Just a reminder that if you would like to ask questions, you can do that. There's the GoToWebinar control panel, probably on the right side of your screen. Again, check the questions tab. You click on the arrow. There's a box for you to enter in your question. Some of them will be answered in writing, as I said, in real time, but I think we're going to have time for live discussion. And also, again, while we're waiting, I'll just note that, Sarah, you've been thanked for your presentation, and there have been a number of questions, and we'll get to them. We'll get to them in just a little bit. But just checking in with Chris, are you able to get the presentation up and going, Chris? Still can't hear you. Are you on the phone audio? Let's, in order to, we're going to troubleshoot behind the scenes with Chris, and we'll move over to Erin, who will talk about business improvement districts and some of the research that RAP has done in a number of different communities, but she'll also be talking specifically about business improvement districts and the situation in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah, thanks, Tristia. And thanks so much to Melissa and everyone at the Law Center for organizing this panel and inviting me to join. Melissa is going to control the slides for me, so thank you so much. My name is, we can start on the previous one. Thanks. Yeah, my name is Erin Goodling. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Research and Development Director at RAP, the Western Regional Advocacy Project. And I think I'm here to talk about the ugly in the title of this webinar. So yeah. RAP is a coalition of homeless-led organizations based in now 7 cities across California, as well as Portland, Oregon, Denver, Philadelphia, Austin, and New York City. And the organization was founded in 2005 by local social justice organizations on the US West Coast, with a mission to expose and eliminate the root causes of homelessness and poverty, to empower communities to demand protection of civil and human rights, and to advocate for restoring for the federal funding that was cut in the early 80s for affordable housing at the federal level. And today, RAP members are united in an effort to stop the sweeps, which I'll say a lot more about, but serial evictions really of homeless people attempting to survive in public space. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about sweeps, and then I'll discuss why RAP is concerned in particular about business improvement districts. Next slide, please. So sweeps are a near daily occurrence for many unhoused people. They typically entail police, public works staff, city contracted cleanup crews, etc., posting an eviction notice next to an encampment, often in response to 911 calls or some other city facilitated complaint process. And encampment residents are expected to dismantle their shelters, pack their stuff, and move along. And the crews confiscate anything left in the area. And next slide. Here's a quote from an outreach worker in San Francisco from last year. I interviewed them and they said, "There's been a huge increase in sweeps. In this last 3 months is when they've started, where the DA, the district attorney, has actually been filing the public lodging misdemeanor, giving them out like hotcakes. And something I've seen that's really concerning, we're seeing a huge increase in people sleeping hard, meaning with no tent or gear, and by themselves. Last week on outreach, this woman who I spoke with in the morning, the cops woke her up and took her tent and gave her a misdemeanor. In the afternoon, she was under the freeway. She was exhausted and got a tarp and tied it to the fence and slept under there and got a second misdemeanor for sleeping. Both of them were for sleeping." And this illustrates what happens to many, like hundreds of thousands of people, truly, day after day, week after week. And next slide. Sweeps generate citations and fines, causing additional barriers to accessing stable housing, as the outreach worker kind of alluded to. They cause people to lose their survival gear and treasured mementos. This is somebody's walker being confiscated in San Francisco. People lose their identification, their medicine. They push people into highly toxic places that exacerbate all kinds of health challenges, and just in short are really traumatizing. And they exacerbate other forms of violence that disproportionately affect people along lines of race, gender, age, disability, and so on. And they, they really do nothing to address the root causes of homelessness. They move people around and further entrench racialized poverty. And during COVID, many local governments slowed down or fully stopped sweeps initially, and people were able to stabilize a bit and establish some mutual aid networks. But in many cities, they're now back as strong as ever, even though the CDC says that they should not be happening. Okay, next slide, please. So now I'm going to transition to talking about business improvement districts, or BIDs. So first, just really quick, what is a BID? BIDs are publicly funded zones that are authorized by city governments. And within certain geographic boundaries, BIDs facilitate extra fee assessments that are levied on property owners. And this revenue then funds services that are above and beyond what might already be publicly provided in that area. And I'll say more about what kinds of services are provided in a moment. They first emerged in the US in the 1980s, and today there are more than 1,200 BIDs in the US cities, spanning a few to a few hundred blocks each. And if you've been in any kind of downtown shopping district, you've probably walked through a BID. And so why does RAP care about BIDs? Over the years, RAP's core member groups, which are all homeless-led groups, have noticed that sweeps, so the evictions that I was talking about before, are especially prevalent and violent in BIDs. They're just really intense there. And we've therefore spent the last few years conducting research on BIDs by combing through public records such as budgets, plans, audits, meeting minutes, etc., to try to understand how BIDs work, just what's happening kind of behind the scenes here. And we've determined that BIDs facilitate sweeps in 3 main ways, which I'll talk about in turn, mostly using examples from Portland where I live, but I'll mention an example from California also. And so next slide, please. Thanks. The first way that bids generate sweeps is very direct. They fund additional policing and security that directly facilitates a higher concentration of sweeps within bid boundaries compared with outside. And again, just it's taken me a long time to wrap my head around what is a bid, so I'll kind of repeat another definition. Bids are bounded areas of a few to several hundred blocks in which nearly all property owners, and I say nearly because occasionally, depending on the city, nonprofits, churches, etc., aren't required to pay the tax or fee. But there are areas in which nearly all property owners are required to pay this special tax or fee collected by the local government and dispersed to a private entity that manages the bid. A small percentage of funds are typically used to pay for services not provided by the city, such as sidewalk accessories, including like holiday lights, planters, branding and marketing materials like light pole banners or newsletters that go out to people living in the area who have businesses in the area, maintenance, etc. But the vast majority of bid revenue in the cities that RAP has studied and that we're paying a lot of attention to is that this bid revenue funds additional police patrols and private security above and beyond what is normally provided by local police bureaus. And so in Portland, where these pictures are from, for example, the Downtown Clean and Safe bid finances, and in Portland, they're called enhanced service districts. You'll see that in different cities, they have slightly different names. In San Francisco, there are some called green benefits districts, some call them community benefits districts, but bid is a pretty good catch-all term. So the Downtown Clean and Safe district finances 4 additional police officers who coordinate directly with bid-funded private security firms. And this may not sound alarming, but some context is important. With the 4 additional police officers, or let me back up a second. In 2017, over half of the arrests in Multnomah County, which comprises most of the city of Portland, were of homeless people. And over 80% of those arrests were for low-level offenses. Things like sleeping, sitting still, standing still, loitering, sitting, eating in public, etc. And we're still working to finalize a map, but we're able to see that it's really clear that there are hotspots that occur within bid boundaries in Portland, that there's a higher concentration in these areas. And to bolster this kind of policing, in Portland and other cities, bids also fund security camera and surveillance programs, as well as district attorney and community court programs that operate as revolving doors for unhoused and poor people committing these kinds of so-called quality of life crimes. Again, sleeping, standing still, sitting, eating, urinating, like things that we have to do to be alive, to exist. And so second, the second way that bids help facilitate sweeps is that they lobby for anti-homeless laws more broadly within and beyond their own jurisdictions. And this contributes to this kind of broader criminalization of homelessness and poverty. And so an example from California helps make this really clear. We can switch slides, thanks. So a 2018 report from the UC Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic that RAP collaborated on confirms that bids spend a significant amount of property assessment revenue, including income from publicly owned properties, on anti-homeless policy advocacy more broadly. And the report illuminates a strong correlation between the growth in the number of bids on one hand and the rise in laws targeting homeless people in the state of California, even outside of bids. And so laws that like prohibit panhandling, for example, this kind of thing. And these advocacy efforts are orchestrated by policy and government relations specialists and registered lobbyists whose salaries are paid by bids and therefore funded by government collected assessments. Okay, next slide. And then finally, bids orchestrate this kind of spending on the systemic criminalization of poverty with little public accountability. A 2020 audit of bids in Portland reveals that despite approximately $12 million annually funneled to local bids, The Revenue Division collects no annual reports or budgets and conducts no annual public audits. This was the first ever sort of overarching citywide audit in the city. City Council, all of the different bureaus that you might imagine to be involved do nothing to oversee the spending of public money on privately controlled policing, in other words. And again, this is $12 million annually that we're talking about with no, we submitted public records requests and got nearly no results because they don't exist. Moreover, there isn't really a democratic process to form bids in many cities that we've looked at. So in Portland, all that's required is an ad hoc approval from City Council. There's no petition, no no community feedback process, no vote, anything else. All that's required is City Council to sign and say, okay, the bid exists now. And any effort to dissolve a Portland bid requires signatures from property owners that make up at least 33% of the property value in the districts. And each city has its own sort of formation and dissolution process, and we've seen different variations of this in different cities. And I should mention just, I'm almost wrapping up here, but even though some bids do provide things like local grants to local organizations or facilitate other kinds of community services that may benefit some homeless people, it still is property owners, and in a lot of cities, the wealthiest property owners who control these programs. And so they don't do a whole lot to ameliorate the conditions that necessitate these kinds of services. So these are the sorts of things that RAP and RAP member groups are concerned about. And yeah, in short, bids use publicly collected funds to privately police public space and those who inhabit it, often with little public accountability. They've steadily transferred control over massive amounts of public space to the city's largest property owners, with pretty dire consequences for poor and unhoused people. And in Portland, and this is the last slide here. In Portland and many other cities, RAP member groups are leading a campaign to stop the sweeps more broadly. And at the heart of this analysis is the role that bids play in sweeps and the criminalization of poverty and homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erin. That was great. We've got a few questions for you as well at the end. We appreciate that. And keeping in the same vein, moving on to Chris Harris. Chris, you've transitioned onto the phone, so I think the audio should be.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Chris Harris in Austin, Texas, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the time, and really appreciate being on this with these folks. And I think a lot of what I have to say about our experience in Austin will really confirms and backs up a lot of what the other speakers have really gone into. So I'm going to be speaking about a campaign that I helped lead in Austin, Texas, similar to the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign nationally, but we call it Homes Not Handcuffs. And so, you know, what we did over about an 18-month period, starting in late 2017 and culminating in June, was to push to decriminalize homelessness within the city of Austin, for which we have been, you know, very successful, though not completely successful. We'll talk a little bit about the business role in that. So first, who Homes Not Handcuffs is, we're a coalition of local Austin housing, faith, civil rights, and criminal justice reform groups. And you can see some of the main members and supporters here. That again, over an 18-month period, really targeted 3 ordinances within Austin. For our goal was complete repeal. What we ended up getting was a significant curtailing, I would say, of these ordinances. So those are comprised of the no camping ordinance, which criminalized using public space as a living accommodation. And how it was written didn't specifically target sleeping, but in that it made actually having your belongings with you part of the criminal act. It really made any form of outdoor sleeping criminalized, as well as sleeping in your own vehicle. Our no sit, no lie ordinance made it a crime to sit or lie down in a specific downtown area. And then our no solicitation or no panhandling ordinance, in theory, targeted what was deemed aggressive panhandling, but in practice was used, on people, generally just asking for money or flying a sign. And so we again undertook about an 18-month campaign, and I will say that there are groups in Austin going back a while that had at various points throughout these ordinances, initial adoption and updates to them, fought every step of the way. So we really were, kind of working from and on the backs of a lot of work that came before in our efforts. One of the things that we did was a participatory action research project, which really engaged many folks experiencing homelessness in our community, and through that process, we found, really were able to highlight so many of the awful effects of criminalization on folks directly impacted by that. And you can see here some of the stats about how those ordinances impacted people on a day-to-day basis. What we also did was a lot of data analysis around tickets, and so there was a huge racial disparity in actually the actual criminalization of people underneath these ordinances. So we found that Black people were 10 times more likely to be cited for camping in Austin, and 6 times more likely to be cited for any of these 3 ordinances. And so this racial justice component of the campaign was really central for us as well. And really it stemmed from an analysis that these laws really go all the way back to the Black codes that were passed during immediate post-emancipation in Texas and many states across the South that criminalized loitering and what was deemed vagrancy, specifically of Black Americans in a very, very overt attempt to return Black people to the institution of slavery in the single place it remained legal, which was in jails and prisons. And so by virtue of criminalizing not working, being in public without work during the day, they could, and they did, funnel Black people back into enslavement, literally back onto plantations. And we still have prisons in Texas that are plantations, and they're still worked overwhelmingly by Black and brown bodies. And so these ordinances stem directly from that history, from that lineage, and they serve a similar purpose, and they're still enacted in a grossly discriminatory way. And so what we were able to do was not, unfortunately, to repeal them, but we were able to limit their application such that out of some frustration, but also out of the actual and honestly a desire by law enforcement to attempt to punish the city for these changes, it's resulted in basically no enforcement of the ordinances now as they're written. And so we have a situation where we were seeing thousands and thousands of these tickets handed out annually. That decreased substantially during the course of our campaign as they hoped we would go away. And it's now down into literally a handful of tickets that have been given out after this spring since the changes last June. So it's been a very successful effort, though the letter of the law is not where we'd like it to be. So as far as the business role in all of this, obviously there's been, I would say, one element of their role that's been very positive, which has been in generally in fundraising. So you can see some of the funding that they've done. The Downtown Austin Alliance here is what we call a PID in Austin. It's the managing entity of a PID for downtown. It's a public improvement district. It's comprised of business owners in the downtown region, and they are, probably the biggest business player within homeless policy. The Austin Chamber has also, the Chamber of Commerce has been very involved in, especially the kind of backlash and response to our decriminalization effort. And together, along with some other groups, they combined to form a group called ATX Helps. which I'll talk a little bit more about what they've been doing since decriminalization went through. But I will give them credit here. I will also say that on the whole, as compared especially to some of the neighborhood groups that have come out in opposition to the decriminalization, they are at least generally can be are honest in their assessment of the situation, as well as in the actual facts about homelessness and its responses. And so whereas there are some groups that are very overt about really about lying and fear mongering, as well as about wanting a complete, not just return to criminalization, but enhanced or increased criminalization. I would say that these groups, while being very effective opponents to our efforts and to decrim, generally will at least stick to the facts. So I want to give them that credit. That said, there's been a lot that they've done that's been extremely harmful to people experiencing homelessness as well. So firstly, just their ongoing over the years, efforts really led to the criminalization and the strengthening of those ordinances over time. So the article on the right here is from 1996, when the camping ordinance in Austin initially went back into effect. And you can see down here the DAA's representatives were the only supporters in the public meetings, yet it still went through overwhelmingly. They also were behind a strengthening and also, of course, just really were an opponent throughout our campaign in attempts to try to keep our efforts from being successful. They also, both before and since, have really highlighted and focused on supporting basically inaccessible shelter first policy. So, in Austin, we do have a lot of the resources for people experiencing homelessness centered in the downtown area. We have the largest shelter. We have a couple of shelters actually, and we have various other faith and community groups that provide different resources to people experiencing homelessness downtown. And so, especially the Downtown Austin Alliance, but now in partnership with ATX Helps and the Chamber, they are really pushing to try to move resources out of downtown, specifically in setting up short-term shelter sites in really inaccessible places. And they've done that in concert with our very regressive governor, who actually gave them access to a state site, former Department of Transportation site, for $1 a month, so that they could try to get folks out there. That same governor really, in the aftermath of our decriminalization, steadily fear-mongered about it. They told everyone in Austin almost on a daily basis would tweet about it being a dangerous city now, and instituted a state-level sweeps campaign to really push folks out to this site that he then handed over to the Austin business community for $1 a month. They've attempted to raise a lot of money, as you can see here, for their effort to put homeless shelters up in this new location. Those efforts have been a spectacular failure. And they now have the property, which did ultimately end up getting a large community out there, largely by virtue of the fact that they undertook this sweeps campaign, a state level sweeps campaign against folks. And now that community really doesn't want these sprung shelters there, or any shelters there. Obviously, they want support in transitioning, back into town, into the community, into housing. And so, anyway, they've been really, I would say that's been a bad part of their response. As far as the ugly part, they really helped feed the local backlash to our decriminalization effort. So one thing they did was they signed an amicus brief challenging the Martin case, which was a central, one of the three kind of planks of our campaign was about the illegal nature or likely illegal nature of the ordinances in Austin. They, again, joined efforts to try to overturn that. The Supreme Court ended up not taking that case. So for now, the Martin decision stands. It doesn't apply necessarily directly to the Fifth Circuit here in Texas, but it is something that the Downtown Austin Alliance was very active in trying to oppose. And they also, did their own bit of fear mongering about our efforts. And honestly, for us, a little bit funnily pointed to cities where they do criminalize homelessness more than we do now as these examples of places that are so bad. So we, which obviously I know is overblown as well, but and what that did was it did lead to some backslide in the ordinances. So we originally got them severely curtailed in late June of 2019, and then in October, the city council came back due in part to some of this backlash that they helped feed, and put some more limitations on it, as you can see here, on camping, sitting, and lying down. This is just a flyer that we handed out to folks in the community about that. But again, thus far, we haven't seen this result in, aside from, kind of an initial very, very ugly sweep around the bigger homeless shelter downtown. We haven't seen it result in criminalization kind of returning as we did before. So, we're continuing to stay diligent on that, and obviously, very much trying to support efforts locally of the city to actually house folks, support folks through COVID-19, and we say now that we see the issue, because obviously homelessness has become much more visible in Austin than it was before. Now that the police aren't running folks off every night. And so we say now that we see this issue, now that it's in our face, we understand it's not just numbers on a page anymore. We're talking about how unaffordable, how unequal, and how unfair and segregated Austin is. Now we can actually see it. So we have to address it. And so that's really where our focus is now as it relates to this. And we also see efforts to divest from policing, especially given that we took such a big thing off of their plate. We took thousands and thousands of tickets and hundreds of warrant arrests away from them by virtue of these ordinance changes. That money should only that should be taken away and put into other things like housing. So we were able, as part of our local City of Austin budget process this year, to get about a $21 million cut to the police budget. $6.5 million of which is earmarked for permanent supportive housing here. So hopefully that's just the start, and we're going to continue to push on that. And with that, we'll submit any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you to all of the panelists for participating. We've got about 16 minutes left for questions. We have a number of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but there are some that I'd like to address. And I think I'm going to work a little bit backward, some of the in terms of presenter order. And so I'll start with you, Chris, and then direct some other questions to panelists in order. But please, the entire panel, feel free to pop in and answer if you have an answer to some of these questions. One question that we got specific to you, Chris, and you did it just as a premise. You did a great job of laying out how the business community has directly contributed to not only criminalization, which is a wholly ineffective and harmful response to houselessness, but you also highlighted really gross, stark racial disparities in enforcement in Austin, Texas, and also responses that contributed, again, to racial segregation in terms of citing of the alternatives where people were pushed. There was a question about the data. So that's really compelling data. Black people are 10 times more likely to be cited for camping, 6 times more likely to be cited for any of the most common ordinances used against unhoused people. How did you get that data?
Mhm.
Who did you request it of? And can you talk a little bit about that in case that same analysis can be done in other cities?
Sure, yeah. So we actually got it from the community court and the municipal court. So all of those tickets, because they're local ordinances in Texas, they're Class C misdemeanors, the lowest level of criminal offense. So those will all run through either the municipal court, if they happen anywhere in the city, or in the downtown community court if they happen specifically in the downtown region. So we would get the numbers from both of those courts, and they would have that data, and we would just combine them together, and then run the numbers that way.
Thank you. Public records requests can be really powerful tools. And to that point, moving to Aaron, one of the things that you talked about, in addition to, again, business improvement districts being drivers of not only lobbying, but also enforcement activity related to these types of criminalization ordinances, you pointed out that there's little to no oversight or accountability, despite the fact that there are millions of dollars in revenue being raised. There isn't the same type of oversight process in the form of audits, and there also isn't the same ability to challenge those practices in the courts, because those private security officers are not always clearly state actors and bound by the same constitutional mandates that police may be. Can you talk a little bit about how the records requests in Portland led to the first ever audit of the Portland bid?
Sure. Let's see, in spring of 2019, we submitted public records requests to, I want to say 4 or 5 city bureaus, including the Portland Police Bureau. And we got a range of responses. Some said, you know, here are a few documents. Some said you need to go to the city archives. It's all publicly available already. Others, the police bureau, the mayor's office in particular, both said it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. And you need to prove to us some kind of a public dissemination plan that, you know, you're sort of worthy of our efforts to dig this data up. And we ended up having a meeting with several officials, the head of the Bureau of Revenue and Finance, I may be getting that title slightly off, but as well as the city attorney's office and some others. And more or less we're just told, you know, a lot of these records that you're asking for just don't exist. And can you remind me the second part of your question, Tristia? Oh, sorry, the audit, how it led to the audit. Yeah, so somebody that works really closely with us, who has just been following how the city auditor's office can help hold different agencies in the city accountable, began just going to the auditor's office and learning more about the process, and going to the archives. And eventually the city auditor decided, you know, this is egregious. This is, you know, millions of dollars going through business improvement districts, just being funneled into public money, being funneled into private policing structures. Enough is enough. We need to figure out what's going on here. And the audit was just released a few weeks ago. So if people are interested, you can email us, rap@raphome.org, or just look on our website.
Thank you very much. And I asked that question in part to highlight the power of records requests. I mean, we know that these records are publicly available records for the most part, and we can learn based on what the records reveal what's happening. We can also learn what's happening based on whether or not records exist. And, you know, the absence of records also tells a story, and organizing was also a consistent theme in your descriptions of how you were able to move the needle, both in curbing some of the return to criminalization and also getting the first ever audit in Portland. So a shout out to organizers and to the power of organizing, in addition to legal strategies for addressing the bad and the ugly contributions that business can make. There were a number of questions for Sarah, because Sarah, you named at the beginning of your presentation that it's no secret that businesses have been a driver of criminalization policies, but that you found a common theme, which is the desire to have people not living outside in public space. And people may have different motivations for why they would not want that. But here, among Among us allies, our motivation typically revolves around a belief in the human right to housing and a belief that human beings are entitled to indoor living, and that we should structure our policies and our funding in a way that supports that. So there are a number of questions for you. I'm going to start with some of the early ones. How did you go about engaging local business? You talked about the speakers tour, but how did you engage local business, and do you have any tips for people who may want to similarly engage business stakeholders to develop the type of housing plans that the Third Door Coalition has developed?
Yeah, one thing I want to say about the ideological point, which is just before I get to the answer to that question, I have been very surprised at what I would call an evolution in the thinking of some of the business leaders who've been involved in the Third Door Coalition, where initially some of the conversations that we would have about chronic homelessness, quite honestly, were really difficult to stomach. And very, emotionally and psychologically draining for me to participate in. Over time, I feel like in some respects, because I wasn't requiring them to have the same ideological perspective that I did, what I've noticed is over time, as they've learned about the data and learned about the sort of the arguments for why permanent supportive housing is such a smarter fix for the solution, I've noticed that the language that they use to talk about it has also shifted, and I've also noticed what I believe to be an evolution in, in the way that they feel about it. And so, are they going to be, diehard liberals? No, I don't think so. But have they made an ideological change as a result of doing this work together? I would say yes. So I just put that out there first. In terms of, for me, the way that it ended up happening, it was totally linked to an explosion, the head tax explosion, with respect to Seattle. And it was such a big deal. I was actually going to talk to some other radio stations about something else, and they didn't want to talk to me about that at all. They just wanted to talk about the head tax. I think business was surprised that my approach was a little more nuanced to why I both supported the head tax, but also understood why it was poorly packaged. And I received an invitation to go and speak to the board of Visit Seattle, which is our largest collection of tourism and hospitality organization. So, Aaron, for the work that RAP does, I think tourism and hospitality are huge drivers, right, of some of the negative policies. That Chris, you're talking about those too. So to have an invitation to come and speak to them, I thought was a really great opening. So I do feel like the approach in particular is a palatable one for people who are interested in hospitality and tourism in particular, because of the connection between visible homelessness and their desire to stop it. It's a very attractive incentive. They actually have an invested interest. They've got a vested interest in trying to see a solution. And so as long as I could get past my desire not to have to work with people who wouldn't be motivated by, my ideological orientation, like I said, I really have seen in those business leaders an evolution over time, where I think the things that brought them to the table initially are no longer the things that are keeping them there. At least they're not the only motivations for why they're staying. The folks who have been involved, to the folks who would like to sort of replicate this, it's really key to find one key business leader, because they will open the door to other business leaders who are also involved. But I also think it's really important for folks to have that intentional culture from the get-go. We don't need to agree on everything. But we need to agree that as soon as we come into the room and start talking about solutions to chronic unsheltered homelessness, that we're partners in this work, and we need to be able to trust each other on that point at least.
Thank you very much. Now, this question is for everyone, and I apologize. This may be the last question that we actually have time for, but we received a number of them about citing, and so I want to just ask a general question about citing. And I think this one specifically asked the question well. In Denver, there has recently been a sanctioned open space policy approved, but they're having trouble finding space. And this question doesn't name it. So, the first part of the question is, how do you engage businesses or work with business leaders to address citing, to ensure that people are not being segregated into to areas of town that aren't neighborhoods of high opportunity, and ensure that people are cited in locations where they can access the public transportation, high quality jobs, high quality education that everyone deserves. And a related question, how can we ensure that these sanctioned encampments, to the extent that we have thoughts about this, how can we ensure that the sanctioned encampments into the sites don't then become the justification for resumed and hyper intensive criminalization activity outside of those sanctioned zones? And that's for everyone.
Well, I'll chime in and say we actually just tried to resist that entirely, and talk about the more overt value of who has access to public space, and does someone's job or someone's income entitle them to a certain space versus other people. And so, there were conversations about trying to couple some sanctions places with the decrim, and we resisted that at every chance that we could. So that, ultimately, aside from the few exceptions they brought back with the, in October following the initial decrim, there aren't any places where it's specifically outlawed or to camp unless you're actually, causing danger to yourself or someone else. So, to the extent that that's already the established policy in a place, I think that's probably a question for somebody else. But there's no place that you have to go if you want to camp legally, and there's no place that you specifically can't be except for within 15 feet of a door, basically, of any door in the city. So.
Thank you, Chris.
I would just add, I think we, in all kinds of messaging and talking about, it's relational, right? Like if someone gets pushed out of one place because the businesses around don't want them there, they move into a toxic site, right? Well, sometimes the landowners there then push people out because they don't want to get sued. It's kind of like this domino effect that can happen. And I think what we just have to remember is, like, modern homelessness, not that we had some dream of a place, especially for Black and Indigenous folks before this, but the early 1980s, prior to this, prior to cutting 80% of federal funding for affordable housing, it wasn't a thing. And so that needs to be at the forefront of all of our conversations about how to address homelessness, instead of just playing whack-a-mole.
Thank you very much. That is going to be it for our Q&A sessions. I will say that the Housing Not Handcuffs 2019 report also talks about zoning, affirmatively furthering fair housing. There are ways to address the issue of citing. Please take a look at our resources and materials. Huge thanks to an excellent panel. We got a lot of comments about how grateful people are for the content that you offered. I'd like to invite everyone to please endorse the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. You heard about different iterations. There's Homes Not Handcuffs, House Keys Not Handcuffs, Housing Not Handcuffs. We're all essentially saying the same things. People need to be in housing, not cycled through the expensive, harmful, ineffective criminal justice system as a response to homelessness. You can find more information about that campaign at housingnothandcuffs.org. Next slide. If you can just bear with us for one more minute, please do consider supporting our work. You can go to the link to donate to the Law Center. We're a nonprofit. We rely on donations. Next slide, please. I think there's a short survey. That's my contact info. The slides will be available on our website, so you can feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of the content that was discussed today. Next slide, please. And I guess we did not have the survey. So with that, thank you all very much for, we do have a quick poll. For those who are still around, if you could just please take a quick moment to answer this poll question. This helps us ensure that the content we're bringing you is actually content that you want. It'll take 10 seconds. Will you use what you've learned today in your advocacy on behalf of people experiencing homelessness? Please select one of the following options: yes, no, not sure. And we'll just wait a few seconds to see whether or not what we talked about today will be useful to you in your own advocacy and work. And very happy to see this. No one answered no. 93% said yes, and the other 7% aren't sure. I would encourage everyone to please check out the resources, both the Law Center's resources, the ones that you heard referenced from the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project, Third Door, Western Regional Advocacy Project, and all of the different specific member campaigns, the COVID-19 response tracker available on our website, and Homes Not Handcuffs, and the great work that Chris Harris is doing over at Texas Appleseed and previously doing at Just Liberty. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. We'll be talking voting. Bye, folks.